The moment Julia Blackwell stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, 3 different people warned her about Abraham Collier before she had even collected her traveling trunk from the luggage rack. The year was 1878, and Redemption Creek sat like a sun-bleached scar along the edge of the Edwards Plateau, where the scrubland rolled on forever in shades of amber and rust, and the sky pressed down so wide and blue it made a person feel both tiny and strangely liberated at the same time. It was not a pretty town in the way that eastern cities were pretty. It was a town that had been built by necessity, by desperation, by people who had run out of road and decided to stop right where they stood. The buildings were mostly raw timber and adobe brick, the main street a broad strip of packed dirt that turned to mud soup when it rained and cracked like old pottery when it did not. There was a saloon, a general store, a livery stable, a small schoolhouse, a church without a proper steeple, and a handful of other establishments that served the ranchers and their hands who came riding in from the surrounding land. Julia had come from Virginia, from a quiet life that had slowly collapsed around her like a house with a rotten foundation. Her father had died of a fever the previous spring, leaving behind debts she could not pay and a farm she could not work alone. Her older brother had gone west 3 years prior and never written back with anything more than the occasional sparse letter. And so when she had seen the advertisement in the Richmond paper placed by a Redemption Creek rancher seeking a housekeeper and cook for his property, she had taken the week to think about it, and then another 3 days to talk herself into it. And then she had packed what she owned into one trunk and one carpet bag, and climbed aboard the first stage heading south and west. She was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair that she wore pinned up beneath a plain felt hat, gray eyes that missed very little, and a posture that her mother had once described as stubbornly upright, which was perhaps the most accurate summary anyone had ever offered of her character. She was not a woman given to dramatics. She was practical, observant, and slower to judge than most people credited her for being. The first warning came from the stagecoach driver himself, a leather-faced man named Rupert, who climbed down from the box and handed her traveling trunk to the ground with a grunt before he said, without particular preamble, "You heading to the Collier spread, ma'am?" "I am," she said. Rupert squinted in the direction of the dry hills to the northwest. "That man don't keep staff long. Drives them off mostly. Cold as January ground, that one." She thanked him for the observation and said nothing else. The second warning came from a stout woman named Mrs. Hattie Drummond, who ran the boarding house where Julia would stay her first night before the wagon came to collect her in the morning. Mrs. Drummond set a bowl of beef stew in front of her with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and then sat down across the table with her hands folded, and her expression carrying the weight of important news. "You the one going out to Collier's Broken Spur Ranch?" she asked. "I am," Julia said again. Mrs. Drummond shook her head with the slow, mournful rhythm of someone watching a lamb walk toward a wolf's den. "That man has not spoken a kind word to a living soul in this town in going on 2 years. Since his wife passed, he turned cold as river stone. The housekeeper before you lasted 11 days. The one before that lasted 3 weeks. He is not a cruel man exactly, people say, but he is not a warm one either. And out there on that ranch, with no neighbors for 8 miles, it is a long kind of cold to sit beside." Julia ate her stew and slept on a narrow bed with a quilt that smelled of cedar and someone else's lavender soap. The third warning came in the morning from a young man at the general store where she waited for her ride. A tall boy of perhaps 19 who was sweeping the porch with more enthusiasm than skill, sending dust clouds drifting sideways in the dry morning wind. "You the new housekeeper for Mr. Collier?" he asked, leaning on his broom with the particular ease of someone who had no personal stake in the answer. "Yes," she said. He whistled low through his teeth. "Good luck to you, ma'am." "My cousin worked at a neighboring ranch and said Collier once went a full week without speaking a word to anyone at all. just worked himself like a machine and stared at the horizon like it owed him something. By the time the wagon arrived, driven by a quiet older Mexican man named Ernesto who tipped his hat and said only that it was a good morning for a drive, Julia had accumulated a thorough portrait of a man she had never met, painted entirely in shades of warning and grim prediction. She told herself she would see what she saw and form her own conclusions. The drive to Broken Spur Ranch took the better part of 2 hours along a hard-packed trail that wound through cedar and mesquite, past dry creek beds and outcroppings of pale limestone, through a landscape that was simultaneously harsh and breathtaking. The sky was immense. The silence had texture to it, a deep, wind-threaded quiet that made the creak of the wagon wheels seem almost conversational. Ernesto drove without speaking, and Julia was glad of it. She watched the land unfold around her and tried to prepare herself for whatever waited at the end of the road. She did not entirely succeed. The Broken Spur Ranch announced itself first by the fence line, long cedar posts with 3 strands of wire that ran in clean, well-maintained rows as far as she could see in both directions. Then came the gate, and beyond it, a long dirt track lined with a few stubborn cottonwood trees that someone had planted years ago, young enough to need planting but old enough now to offer genuine shade. The main house was low and solid, built of adobe with a wide covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides, a house that had been designed with purpose rather than beauty, but that had gathered a kind of weathered dignity over the years. The yard was swept clean. The barn beyond it was in excellent repair. Everything was orderly in a way that spoke of someone who maintained things out of discipline rather than pleasure. Ernesto stopped the wagon and climbed down to collect her trunk, and Julia stepped down into the yard and adjusted her hat against the morning sun. That was when Abraham Collier walked around the corner of the barn. He was not what she had assembled in her imagination from the stagecoach driver's warning, and the boarding house woman's mournful shaking of her head, and the young store sweeper's low whistle. She had imagined something pinched and angular, a man who had let grief and isolation carve away everything soft until only something flinty remained. What she saw instead was a man of perhaps 30 years, tall and broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from actual labor and not performance, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that was shadowed with several days of dark stubble. He wore working clothes, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, worn canvas trousers, and dusty boots, and he was carrying a bucket of water that he had clearly been bringing from the well, because his forearms were wet to the wrist. He stopped when he saw her. Not with surprise exactly, more like a man who had expected something and found himself briefly recalibrating the specific reality of the thing versus the abstract idea he had been carrying around. He set the bucket down. "Miss Blackwell," he said. His voice was low and flat, not unfriendly but not warm either, and he offered no smile with it. "Mr. Collier," she said. He looked at her for a moment with dark eyes that were measuring and direct without being rude, and then he said, "Ernesto will show you where things are. Dinner is at 6. Breakfast is at 5:30. I don't keep a long list of rules, but I keep a few, and they're not complicated." He paused. "I'm glad you came." He said those last 3 words with such careful blankness that she could not tell whether he meant them at all or whether he had simply decided they were appropriate to say. Then he picked up his bucket and continued walking toward the barn without looking back. She stood in the yard for a moment and thought about all 3 warnings she had received, and then she went inside with Ernesto to learn the shape of her new life. The house was clean, which surprised her. Not pristine, not the kind of clean that suggested someone had been trying to impress her, but the everyday, unself-conscious cleanliness of someone who simply did not tolerate disorder. The kitchen was large and well-equipped for a ranch of this size, with an iron stove, a good work table, proper storage for dry goods, and a root cellar accessible through a wooden hatch in the floor. Her room was small but had a window that looked out toward the east and a good bed with a mattress that had not yet given up entirely on its purpose. Ernesto showed her where everything was kept, speaking in a mixture of English and Spanish that she followed well enough, because she had grown up in a county that had more than a few Spanish-speaking families, and she had absorbed more of the language than she had ever formally studied. He told her that he worked the horses and did the heavy outdoor maintenance, that there were 2 other ranch hands who came and went named Pete and Callum, that Mr. Collier rose before dawn every single day, that he took his meals at precise times, that he did not complain about food as long as there was enough of it, and that he was not a man who needed to fill silence with words. That last part, at least, Julia could appreciate. She was not herself a woman who feared silence. She spent the rest of that first day learning the kitchen and the house, taking inventory, making a list of what would need to be ordered from town, and cooking a simple supper of salt pork, beans, and cornbread that she had going in plenty of time for the 6 o'clock hour. She laid the table in the kitchen as she imagined it was usually laid, plates and cups and a pitcher of water, and at 6 o'clock exactly, Abraham Collier came through the back door, washed his hands at the basin, sat down and said, "Thank you," before he began to eat. He ate efficiently and without complaint, which she had been told to expect. What she had not been told to expect was that halfway through the meal he looked up from his plate and said, "The beans are better than they've been in a while," she said. "I added a bit of molasses and a smoked ham bone from the larder." He nodded, as if she had confirmed something he had already deduced, and returned to his plate. It was not a flood of warmth, but it was something. By the end of her first week at Broken Spur Ranch, Julia had developed a working rhythm that suited the place, and she suspected, suited her employer, because he had not fired her and he had not been cold beyond the flat, functional way he conducted all his communications. He was not talkative. He was not demonstrative. He did not appear to require entertainment or conversation or the kind of cheerful social lubricant that some employers expected from household staff. But he was also not, she was discovering, the stone-cold figure that everyone in Redemption Creek had described. The first thing she noticed that contradicted the town's portrait of him was the dog. On her 3rd morning, she had gone out early to the porch to drink her coffee and watch the sunrise paint the limestone hills in shades of rose and amber, and she had found Abraham already there, sitting in one of the 2 wooden chairs with a cup of his own coffee, and at his feet was a large, grizzled, sand-colored hound of indeterminate breed that was clearly ancient, moving through the world with the deliberate care of something very old and a little fragile. Abraham was scratching the old dog's ears with one hand, slowly, absently, in the way of someone who does a thing without thinking about it because they have done it for years and the habit has become part of the fabric of their days. He did not acknowledge her presence right away, and she did not interrupt the moment. She simply sat in the other chair and drank her coffee and watched the sunrise. After a while, without looking away from the horizon, he said, "That's Biscuit. He's 15 years old. Vet in Fredericksburg told me 6 months ago that I should expect to lose him soon." He paused. "I don't intend to." There was nothing dramatic in how he said it. But the steadiness of it, the quiet determination underneath, told her something true about the man that no one in Redemption Creek had thought to mention. "He looks like he has some fight left in him," she said. Abraham looked down at Biscuit, who raised his milky eyes up toward his owner with the trusting serenity of a very old animal who has decided that the world is mostly good because the person it loves is there. "He does," Abraham said, and the flatness in his voice cracked, very slightly, like thin ice in early spring. She drank her coffee and said nothing more, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. The second thing she noticed happened at the end of her first week, on a Friday, when Pete and Callum, the 2 ranch hands, came in for dinner. Pete was a wiry, red-haired man somewhere in his early 30s who talked with the relentless enthusiasm of someone who had been starved of an audience, and Callum was a quiet, broad Scotsman who communicated primarily through various degrees of nodding. They clearly held Abraham in a respect that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with trust, which Julia filed away as significant, because frightened men showed a very different kind of deference than respected ones. During dinner, Pete told an elaborate story about a horse that had refused to be shod that afternoon, a story that grew increasingly improbable as it continued, and partway through it Abraham, who had been sitting with his usual still attention, said, in a perfectly dry and expressionless voice, "Pete, that horse weighs 900 pounds. It did not jump over the fence." Pete opened his mouth, reconsidered, grinned, and said, "Well, it felt like it." And Abraham Collier, cold as January ground, as the stagecoach driver had said, allowed the corner of his mouth to do something that was indisputably, if briefly, a smile. Julia filed that away too. The following Saturday, she rode into town with Ernesto to collect the supplies she had ordered, and while Ernesto handled the heavier loading, she went into Mrs. Drummond's boarding house for a cup of tea, because the woman had been kind to her on her first night and Julia was not one to forget kindness. Mrs. Drummond greeted her with evident relief. "You're still there," she said, as if she had half expected Julia to come back into town on foot and in pieces. "I'm still there," Julia agreed. And Mrs. Drummond leaned forward with the intensity of someone who very much needed the report to confirm what she already believed. Julia wrapped both hands around her teacup and thought for a moment about how to answer honestly. "He is not a talkative man," she said at last, "but he is not cruel. He is not cold in the way you described. He is quiet and there is grief in him, that's plain, but he is not unkind." Mrs. Drummond looked as if she had been handed information that did not fit the frame she had built for it. She said. "Well, perhaps you just haven't seen enough of him yet." Julia thanked her for the tea and went back to the wagon. In the weeks that followed, she saw more. She saw him leave a plate of food outside the barn for the 3 stray cats that had taken up residence there. Something, Ernesto confirmed, had been going on for more than a year. She saw him, on a stormy Tuesday afternoon, work for 2 straight hours in the driving rain to repair a section of roof on the chicken coop, rather than let it go until morning because the hens were distressed, and then come inside soaking wet, and accepting the dry towel she handed him without a word of complaint, only a slightly sheepish expression that suggested he was aware he looked rather like a man who had been dropped in a river. She saw him, on a quiet evening, sit at the kitchen table with a letter he was clearly struggling to write, crumpling 3 attempts before he finally got something onto the page that satisfied him, and when he left the room she caught a glimpse of the name at the top, Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, and beneath it, something about paying the family's doctor bill, which was none of her business and which she mentioned to no one, but which lodged itself in the growing record she was keeping in her own mind. She began to understand, as September turned the scrubland gold and the mornings grew crisp with the first suggestion of autumn, that the picture everyone in Redemption Creek had painted of Abraham Collier was not a lie exactly, but it was an incomplete truth, the kind of portrait that comes from watching a man from a distance after loss has wrapped itself around him like a second skin, and mistaking the silence of grief for the silence of coldness. She also began to understand, with a clarity that was both welcome and alarming, that she was watching him more than the duties of her position required. She noticed the way he stood when he was thinking hard about something, one hand braced on whatever was near him, chin slightly down, as if the thought required weight-bearing. She noticed that he always thanked Ernesto at the end of the day, never loudly, never with flourish, but consistently every single evening, which was not something many ranch owners would bother to do. She noticed that he read, which surprised her given that the warnings had assembled someone of blunt practicality, and that the books on the shelf in the main room were not just almanacs and livestock guides, but novels and history, a worn copy of Dickens, a volume of Tennyson with its spine cracked from genuine use. She noticed, most uncomfortably, that when he came into a room she became more precisely aware of exactly where she was standing in it. The matter came to a particular head on an evening in late September when a storm rolled in fast from the northwest, with the abruptness that Texas storms reserve for their most dramatic performances. Julia had been sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, writing a letter to her former neighbor in Virginia, and she had just reached the point in the letter where she was trying to describe the landscape without making it sound either terrifying or overwhelmingly beautiful, both of which were true, when the first crack of lightning split the sky so close that it lit the entire kitchen white, and the thunder followed immediately with a sound like the earth splitting at the seams. The lights in the house, such as they were, 2 oil lamps flickered. The wind hit the walls. The rain came in a sheet so heavy it was as if someone had upended an ocean. She heard the dogs barking outside, all 3 of the younger ranch dogs who slept in the barn, and then she heard Abraham's boots on the floor of the main room and the front door open, which made no sense to her at all because the man would be soaked before he reached the porch steps. She went to the front window. Through the rain and the flashes of lightning she could see him moving across the yard in the direction of the barn, and she could see why. One of the barn doors had come open and was banging against the frame with violent, repeated crashes that, in a bad storm, could tear the thing off its hinges. He was fighting the wind to get it closed, and it was, she could see, genuinely difficult. The latch must have been pulled loose by the force of the gusts. Without giving herself time to reconsider, she grabbed her shawl, went out through the back door, circled the house, and crossed the yard at a run that got her thoroughly soaked in approximately 8 seconds. When she reached the barn, he looked up with genuine surprise, because he had clearly expected to handle this alone. "Hold the door on the other side," he said, shouting slightly over the wind. "Pull toward me when I push." She did exactly that. It took 3 tries because the wind was gusting unpredictably, but on the third pull the door swung shut and he threw the heavy iron latch into place and drove the iron pin through with the heel of his hand. They stood for a moment on the sheltered side of the closed barn door, panting slightly, drenched to the skin, the rain roaring on the roof above them. The horses inside were unsettled but not panicked, and the sound of their movement, hooves on packed earth, was calming in its ordinary way. Abraham turned and looked at her. She was, she knew, a spectacular mess. Her hair had come entirely out of its pins and was plastered to her face and neck. Her shawl was soaked through and offered precisely no warmth or dignity. She was standing in a Texas rainstorm at 10 o'clock in the night looking like she had lost an argument with a river, and for some reason, standing in that absurd soaking mess of a situation, the corner of her mouth went up before she could stop it. He stared at her for a moment. And then, quietly in the rain-shadowed darkness of the barn doorway, Abraham Collier laughed. It was not a long laugh. It was not a theatrical one. It was the surprised, real laugh of a man who had not expected to find anything funny and had been caught off guard by it, and it transformed his face in a way that hit her somewhere beneath her sternum with a kind of physical force she was entirely unprepared for. "You didn't have to come out," he said, when the laugh had settled back into his usual quiet. "I know that," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer with an expression she could not fully read in the dark and the rain. Then he said, "Come on," and they walked back to the house through the storm together, which was, in the grand scheme of things, a very small and ordinary event, and which she spent the next 3 days turning over in her mind with the dedicated attention of a woman who is trying very hard not to admit something to herself. October arrived and brought with it a crisis that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the larger world pressing itself against the edges of Broken Spur Ranch. A neighboring rancher named Gideon Marsh, who held land to the south and east, had been quietly expanding his fence lines for the better part of 2 years, a process that involved moving markers in the night and then asserting, with great confidence and poor evidence, that the land in question had always been his. This was not an unusual practice in the expanding Texas cattle country of 1878, and it was not a small problem. Several families in the county, including 1 or 2 smaller operations that barely held on as it was, had lost acreage to Marsh's confident, well-lawyered expansion. Marsh had his eye on a section of Broken Spur's southern range, land that included access to a reliable creek that ran year-round, which in the dry country of the Edwards Plateau was as valuable as gold in the ground. Julia learned about this not from Abraham directly but from Pete, who had the news-carrying instincts of a man who had spent too much time in places without entertainment, and who brought it home at dinner one evening with all the enthusiasm of someone delivering a dispatch from the front. Marsh sent a letter, Pete said, helping himself to more of Julia's chicken and sage dumplings with one hand while gesturing with his fork in the other. Claims his south line runs 40 rods north of where we've always had the wire. Says if Mr. Collier doesn't pull the fence back, he'll take it to the county court. Abraham, who was eating with his usual contained efficiency, set his fork down and said, "It runs where it has always run. I have the original survey." "You plan to go to court over it?" Pete asked. "I plan to go to the county seat next week and have a conversation with the surveyor's office," Abraham said. "If that requires a court after, then yes." Julia looked across the table at him. His jaw was set in the way she had come to recognize as controlled irritation rather than explosive anger, and his eyes were steady. He was not a man who escalated without reason, but he was also not, she was becoming very clear, a man who backed down from a legitimate position. "Will you need help?" she asked. She was not entirely sure why she asked it. It was not strictly within her responsibilities as a housekeeper. He looked at her. "Can you read a survey plat?" he asked, without the condescension the question might have carried from another man. He asked it as if he genuinely wanted to know whether she could. "I can," she said, because her father had taught her, in those years when the farm's margins were tight and she had helped him navigate the paperwork. He said, "Then yes. I'd like a second set of eyes on the documentation before I go." That evening, he brought the property papers to the kitchen table after dinner, and they sat across from each other with the survey plat spread between them and 2 oil lamps burning, and she read through it carefully while he showed her the relevant markers and measurements. It was practical and businesslike, and they barely spoke beyond what the documents required, and yet it was also, she recognized very precisely, the first time they had sat across a table from each other by choice rather than circumstance. He pointed to a notation in the margin of the survey, a small mark she had initially passed over. "There," he said. The original surveyor marked the creek as the eastern boundary reference point for the southern range. Marsh is claiming the line predates that notation, which it cannot, because the notation is in the original hand. She leaned forward to look more closely and said, "And the date on the notation matches the original filing date." "Exactly," he said. He looked at her with something in his eyes that was quiet and direct and almost, she thought, surprised. "You do read it." "My father taught me to read everything carefully," she said. "He said paperwork was the enemy of honest men who didn't pay attention to it." Something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, but visibly. "He sounds like a sensible man." He was, she said. And because grief was something she recognized in others, having worn it herself for the better part of a year, she said it simply in the past tense and did not elaborate, and he did not press her. They sat for a few more minutes in the lamplight with the documents between them, and then she gathered them neatly and folded them along their original creases, and he said, "Thank you, Miss Blackwell," and she said, "Good night, Mr. Collier," and they each went to their separate parts of the house. She lay in her bed for a long time listening to the coyotes call across the dark hills, and thought that she should write to her former neighbor in Virginia and correct her previous letter, the one in which she had said the landscape was merely interesting. It was, she now knew, more than interesting. And so, she admitted to herself in the privacy of the dark, was the man who lived in it. The county seat trip resolved the matter more or less in Abraham's favor, though Marsh did not accept the resolution gracefully, and was heard around town making various bitter pronouncements. The surveyor's records backed Broken Spur's boundaries completely, which was not a surprise to Abraham or to Julia, but which was a relief in the practical sense, because a legal fight over land would have cost time and money and the season of work that surrounded it. He came back from the county seat on a Thursday afternoon, and when he came through the kitchen door, he set a small paper package on the table and said, "They had a good general store in Fredericksburg," and then went a wash before dinner. Julia looked at the package. Her name was written on it, in a hand that was blunt and precise, not fancy but entirely legible. Inside the paper was a small book, a new collection of poetry by a poet she had mentioned once, briefly, in passing, more than 3 weeks ago, when she had noticed the Tennyson on the shelf and said she had always found verse good company on quiet evenings. She stood in the kitchen with the book in her hands for a long moment, and then she put it on the counter and went back to her stew and did not say anything about it at dinner. But he caught her eye once during the meal, and there was something in his expression that was careful and watchful in a new way, a way that told her the book had not been incidental. November came cold and quick, with frost on the grass in the mornings and a bite to the wind that swept down from the north and made the whole landscape lean southward. The cattle were brought into the lower pastures, the horses were given extra feed, and the household settled into the deeper rhythm of winter's approach, which on a Texas ranch meant less of certain kinds of work and more of others, repair and preparation, and the long, lamplit evenings that were different in character from the burning long days of summer. One evening in mid-November, Biscuit the old dog had a bad night. Julia found him in the morning lying on his side near the hearth in the main room, breathing in a labored, uneven way that was different from sleep. She went straight to the barn, where Abraham was already at work, and she said simply, "Biscuit is not well this morning. I think you should come." He was there before she finished the sentence. He sat on the floor beside the old hound for an hour, his back against the wall, one hand resting on Biscuit's gray flank, and Julia brought him coffee and then sat in the chair nearby and did not speak because there was nothing useful to say. Biscuit breathed and then his breathing eased, and by mid-morning he had rallied enough to drink some water and lift his head. Abraham did not say anything for a long time after. He just sat with his hand on the dog and his face doing the complicated, suppressed work of a man who cares very much and has practiced for a long time at not showing it. Then, without looking at her, he said, "My wife liked this dog better than she liked most people." Julia set her coffee cup down very quietly. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife in any context that was personal rather than incidental. "She sounds like she had excellent judgment," Julia said. He let out a breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "She did." He was quiet for a moment. "Her name was Catherine. She died 2 years ago in January, fever." He said it flatly, not like he was testing the words so much as he was making sure they were still real. "The ranch hands, the people in town, they think grief made me cold. Maybe it did for a while." He looked up at her then, and his dark eyes were more open than she had ever seen them, the guarded quality still there but set further back. "But I think mostly it just made me quiet." She looked at him steadily. "There is a difference," she agreed. "Most people don't care to notice it," he said. "I noticed," she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that contains a great deal, the way a well-built room contains the warmth a fire has made even after the fire has burned down. He looked at her a moment longer, and she did not look away, and then Biscuit lifted his head and licked Abraham's hand with the slow authority of a very old dog who has decided the drama has gone on long enough, and they both, separately, smiled. Biscuit recovered over the following week, which Julia chose to take as evidence that determination mattered even in dogs. Something had shifted between them after that morning on the floor of the main room. It was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. But the quality of the silence between them changed. Before, the silence had been neutral, the mutual functional quiet of two people sharing a space with defined roles. After, it was warmer, more aware, the silence of two people who had learned something about each other and were still, carefully, deciding what to do with the knowledge. He started staying in the kitchen after dinner more often. Not always and never until late, but where before he had eaten and returned to the main room or gone straight to bed with the methodical efficiency of a man with a 5:30 morning. He now sometimes remained at the table with his coffee while she finished tidying up, and they talked, not about anything large or consequential at first, about the ranch, the cattle prices, what Ernesto had said about the south pasture fence, what she thought about whether the root cellar needed more insulation before true winter settled in. But the conversations widened, the way rivers do when they reach flatter ground. He told her about growing up on a ranch in South Texas, near the Rio Grande. His father, a strict, demanding man who had loved the land with a ferocity that left little room for anything else, and how Abraham had learned to read in secret, almost, because his father thought books were a waste of time for working people. He told her how he had saved money for 3 years after his father's death and bought the Broken Spur Ranch, cheap because the previous owner had let it run down, and built it back up over the course of a decade with his own hands and Ernesto's help and a great deal of stubbornness. She told him about Virginia, about the farm and her father, about what it was like to watch something you loved slowly fall apart and not be able to stop it. She told him that she had always wanted to go west, not because of the romance of it that the Eastern papers liked to paint, but because the space appealed to her, the literal, physical space, the idea of a horizon that was not hemmed in by hills and trees and the accumulated expectations of a place that had known her family for 3 generations, and therefore felt it had opinions about what she should do with herself. He listened the way some people do not, with his full attention, not waiting for his turn to speak. In December, Pete announced at dinner that he had plans to marry a woman in Fredericksburg and was giving his notice at the end of the month, which everyone received with varying degrees of good feeling and genuine surprise. Pete gave a lengthy speech about the woman in question, whose name was Ruth and who had apparently appeared in his life like a comet and reorganized everything around her. And Callum nodded through the whole speech with the deep sincerity of someone who did not entirely understand it, but supported it completely. After Pete finished and went off to write an enthusiastic letter to Ruth, and Callum had gone to the bunkhouse, Julia was at the sink and Abraham was still at the table with the second cup of coffee. He had recently begun allowing himself on evenings when the work was done, and she said, "Are you glad for him?" "I am," Abraham said. "Pete is a man who needs someone to talk to. He will be very happy." She laughed, which she did more often now than she had in September, and he said, "I mean that genuinely," and she said, "I know you do, that's why it's funny." And he looked at her with a warmth in his eyes that was quite different from flatness and quite different from the cold river stone of Mrs. Drummond's description, and he said, "You laugh easily." "I didn't used to," she said. "I think the space helps." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'm glad you came here, Miss Blackwell." He had said it before, on the first day, in that careful blank way that might have meant nothing at all. He said it now in a way that meant everything it said. She turned from the sink and looked at him. "I'm glad, too," she said. Christmas came to Redemption Creek in the particular, spare way it came to frontier settlements, without much decoration and without much fuss, but with enough warmth in the gathering of people to make the season real. Ernesto spent Christmas with his sister's family in a Mexican settlement south of town, and Callum went to Fredericksburg with Pete, who was managing the approach to his wedding with the focused intensity of a man on a military campaign. Julia had assumed she would spend the holiday quietly at the ranch, which she did not mind, but Abraham came to her 3 days before and said, formally, and with a slight awkwardness she was beginning to find endearing, "There is a gathering at the Montoya family's place on Christmas Day. They have had it every year, neighbors from the surrounding ranches. It is nothing formal. I would like to attend if you would be willing to come." She recognized that he had not gone the previous year or the year before that, because the grief had made the idea of it intolerable. She understood what it meant that he was asking now, and what it meant that he was asking her. "Yes," she said. "I would like that." The Montoya Ranch was 8 miles south and east, and they drove there in Abraham's best wagon on a bright, cold Christmas morning, the sky the particular winter blue of Texas, hard and clear and infinite. The Montoya family were a large, generous, loud gathering of people. The patriarch, a white-haired man named Fernando, who greeted Abraham with an embrace that suggested a long friendship, and who took Julia's hand and welcomed her with such unaffected warmth that she felt immediately that she had arrived somewhere she had permission to be. There were perhaps 20 people there, from 4 or 5 neighboring operations, a mixture of Anglo, Mexican, and one Apache-descended family from a small ranch to the north, named the Red Hawks, who had been operating their land since before most of the territory's current residents had arrived, and who were received with the warmth of long friendship by the Montoyas, and regarded with varying degrees of curiosity by the others. Julia spoke briefly with the youngest Red Hawk, a woman near her own age named Maria, who had a dry humor and an observational precision that Julia immediately liked. Maria glanced across the gathering at Abraham, who was in conversation with Fernando Montoya, and then back at Julia and said, very quietly, "You are the one who has lasted." Julia raised an eyebrow. "At Collier's ranch," Maria said, "everyone is surprised. The last housekeeper ran into town after 2 weeks and said he was impossible. Before her there were 2 others." She tilted her head, watching Abraham with the same objective attention she might give a fence she was evaluating for structural soundness. "But he looks different today. He looks like a man who has something to look forward to going home to." Julia said nothing to that, which was, she reflected, a more eloquent answer than anything she might have said. Abraham drove them home in the early evening through the cold dark. The stars spread across the sky in the extravagant abundance that was only possible far from town lights, and they sat side by side on the wagon bench with their shoulders nearly touching, and he told her about the first time he had come to the Montoya Christmas, 20 years old and newly arrived in the county, knowing almost no one, Fernando Montoya pressing food on him until he'd had to admit defeat. "He is a kind man," Julia said. "He is one of the best men I know," Abraham said, with the matter-of-fact sincerity that was, she had learned, one of his most particular qualities. He did not distribute praise easily or without meaning it. They were quiet for a while, the cold air clean and sharp around them, the horse moving at a steady walk along the familiar road. The stars above were impossibly bright. Then he said, "I have not been to the Montoyas since Catherine died." She waited. "I did not think I would want to go back," he said. "I thought it would feel wrong." He paused. "It did not feel wrong today." She understood what he was saying and what he was not quite saying, and she thought about whether to respond to the part he had said or the part he had not said, and she decided on honesty, which was not always the safest choice but was generally the most useful one. "I'm glad it felt right," she said, "and I'm glad I was with you." He turned to look at her then in the cold dark of the wagon, the stars huge above them and the land rolling quiet and deep on all sides, and he said, "Julia," which was the first time he had used her given name. "Abraham," she said, using his in return, and the sound of it was a little like opening a door. He reached over very slowly and took her hand where it rested on her knee, wrapping his around it, and they rode the rest of the way home like that, in the bright cold dark, saying nothing at all because nothing more needed saying yet. The new year, 1879, arrived with a cold snap that froze the creek edges and turned the morning puddles to crackling glass. The ranch went through the first weeks of January in the deep quiet of a working property in its slow season. The cattle settled, the horses routined, the days short and the evenings long. Everything between them was changed, and also, in the way of things that change honestly, more itself than before. They did not perform the change. They simply lived inside it, and it fit like something that had always been there waiting. He asked her, in the second week of January, to ride out with him to check the south fence, the section that had been at the center of the marsh dispute. She had not ridden much since Virginia, but she was comfortable enough in the saddle, and the mare he put her on was a sensible animal named Henrietta, who had clearly decided years ago that excessive drama was not worth the effort. They rode out in the bright January cold, through the cedar scrubland and across the frost-pale grass of the lower pastures, and when they reached the south fence he checked it methodically, testing each post, checking the wire, looking for signs of tampering, because Marsh had not entirely retreated and might or might not choose to express his feelings about the county surveyor's findings in physical, nocturnal ways. The fence was undisturbed. Abraham stood at the fence line and looked south over the range that ran down to where the creek bent through a stand of cypress and cottonwood, the water winter-low but running clear. The sky was sharp and pale. A hawk turned slow circles high above the limestone ridge in the distance. 15 years ago this was empty range, he said, not with sentiment exactly, but with the kind of careful accounting of a man who needs to verify that what he has built is real. Nothing here but mesquite and rattlesnakes. And now, she said. He looked at her. And now it is something worth fighting for, he said, and then seemed mildly surprised by his own words, as if they had come out more freighted than he had intended, but he did not pull them back. She held his gaze. It is, she said. The hawk turned another slow circle above them, and the wind came down off the plateau, and the creek ran cold and clear through the cypress, and Julia Blackwell, who had come west with a trunk and a carpet bag and a list of someone else's warnings, thought that she understood, finally and completely, something she had been learning for months, not just about Abraham, but about herself, about what she had been looking for without knowing she was looking for it. He crossed the space between them in 2 steps, and she thought briefly that he was going to say something further, and then he simply took her face in his gloved hands, careful and deliberate, and kissed her in the January cold beside his fence line. And it was not a tentative kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had thought about this with great care and had decided, having thought about it, that he meant it entirely. She kissed him back with equal conviction. When they separated, the hawk was still turning in the pale sky and the wind was still blowing, and nothing about the landscape had changed in the least, but everything in it felt different, specific, important, hers in a way it had not been before. He looked at her with dark eyes, and the expression he wore was not guarded at all. I should have said this before, he said. I'm not skilled at saying things, but Julia, I should like very much for you to stay, not as my housekeeper. She studied him for a moment because she was a woman who believed in the importance of clarity. What are you asking? She said, not to make it difficult, just to make it real. I am asking, he said, if you would consider marrying me, if you could see yourself building a life on this ranch, with me. He paused. I am aware I am not a simple man to live with. I am aware I have been described to you as cold and difficult, and I understand why people have said those things. But I believe you see something different. I see exactly who you are, she said. I have been seeing it since the 3rd morning when you were scratching an old dog's ears on the porch without knowing I was watching. And yes, Abraham, yes, he breathed out. It was a small sound, but it had the quality of a man who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally been given leave to set it down. They rode back to the ranch in the January cold, with the knowledge of what had been decided between them lying warm against all the weather. And that evening, he brought out a ring that had been his grandmother's, plain silver with a small garnet, and he put it on her finger at the kitchen table while Biscuit watched from his place by the stove with the mild, approving authority of an elder statesman who had seen this coming long before anyone else. They married in March, when the bluebonnets were coming up in the lower pastures, and the live oaks were putting out new leaves so intensely green they seemed almost to glow. The wedding was small, held at the Montoya Ranch with Fernando Montoya's wife, Rosa, organizing the food, with an enthusiasm that produced quantities sufficient for a gathering 3 times the size they had. Ernesto was there, and Callum and Pete, who arrived with his new wife Ruth, a compact, red-haired woman with a forthright manner that explained immediately why Pete was so comprehensively devoted to her. Maria Redhawk came, and the Drummond family from town, and even the stagecoach driver Rupert, who appeared to have been invited by general consensus, and who said to Julia quietly when she passed him near the table of food that he was glad to have been wrong about the man. "You were not entirely wrong," Julia told him. "You just weren't looking at the right things." Rupert considered this and decided it was a reasonable settlement and helped himself to more of Rosa Montoya's tamales. Abraham stood at the front of the room and watched Julia walk toward him in a dress she had made from blue wool she had ordered from Fredericksburg, and the expression on his face was not the contained, flat stillness that had made all of Redemption Creek diagnose him as cold. It was the open, steady look of a man who is precisely where he means to be, looking at exactly who he means to be looking at, and who has no intention of looking away. Fernando Montoya, who had undertaken the solemnizing of the ceremony with great good cheer, pronounced them married in the mid-March afternoon with the sound of the wind in the live oaks outside the open windows and the smell of roses cooking hanging warm and good in the air. Abraham kissed her. Pete cheered with the enthusiasm of a man who always cheered enthusiastically at any occasion that allowed it. Biscuit, who had been brought along in the wagon and was sleeping beside Ernesto's chair, opened one eye, decided the commotion was benign, and went back to sleep. They went home to Broken Spur Ranch as husband and wife, in the blue and gold of a Texas March evening, and the horses knew the way so well that Abraham didn't need to guide them at all, and he held Julia's hand the whole drive home in the easy, habitual way that already felt as if it had always been so. The summer of 1879 was a working summer, as all summers on a ranch of that size necessarily were. They settled into the life of it together, which was not always simple, because Abraham had spent years alone and had deeply ingrained habits, and Julia had firm opinions about the running of things that did not always align with his, and there were conversations that required patience and occasionally required one or the other of them to go stand outside for a few minutes before resuming. But they were also two people who had both learned, by necessity, the value of honesty and the waste of drama. Their disagreements were practical, specific, and resolved with the same methodical attention that Abraham brought to the repair of a fence or the management of his cattle books. They did not let things fester. They did not perform. Gideon Marsh tried, one July morning, to make his presence felt again by hiring a pair of rough men to cut Broken Spur's south fence in the night, a fact discovered by Ernesto at dawn. Abraham rode to Marsh's property directly, and Julia, who knew better than to try to stop him but also knew better than to let him ride alone, came with him, and they presented themselves at Marsh's door in the early morning light with the specific, contained energy of two people who are entirely serious. Abraham told Marsh, calmly and in complete sentences, that the fence would be repaired at Marsh's expense, that the county sheriff would be receiving a written account of the incident this same day, and that any further interference with Broken Spur property would result in legal consequences that Abraham was prepared and willing to pursue. Marsh, a large man who had clearly expected either more anger or more fear than he was receiving, looked from Abraham to Julia and seemed to find something in the combined presentation before him that made his own position feel less solid. "This isn't finished," Marsh said. "It will be," Abraham said, with the simple certainty of someone who is stating a fact rather than making a threat. "Good morning." They rode home. The county sheriff received his written account. Marsh did not interfere with Broken Spur again. Julia looked at her husband that evening across the kitchen table and thought that the people of Redemption Creek had assembled their portrait of Abraham Collier from the outside, from the flatness and the silence, and had mistaken the still surface of a deep river for the shallows of a frozen pond. She thought about how easy it was to see only what you expected to see, how much more effort it took to look steadily at a thing until it revealed itself. She had looked, she had seen. In the autumn of 1879, Julia knew she was expecting a child, and she told Abraham on a Tuesday evening in the kitchen in the direct, unceremonious way that was both of their natural mode. And he sat very still for a moment, and then stood up from the table and crossed to her, and put his arms around her with a care that was extraordinary coming from a man of his size and usual reserve, and held her for a long time without saying anything, his face pressed against her hair. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He said, "Good," and held on a moment longer. They wrote to Ernesto first, who was family in every way that mattered, and who received the news with enough visible emotion that he excused himself to the barn for 10 minutes and came back with suspiciously red eyes that he attributed to dust. Callum was told at dinner and expressed his congratulations by nodding with such intensity and for such an extended period of time that Pete's wife Ruth, who had come to visit, had to turn away to prevent herself from laughing. Mrs. Drummond, in town, greeted the news of Julia's condition with the enthusiasm of someone who has been monitoring a situation for developments and is deeply gratified by the current report. She had long since revised her opinion of Abraham Collier, partly because Julia had offered her enough specific counter-evidence over the months that the picture had simply become impossible to maintain, and partly because she had seen them together at the Fredericksburg market one autumn afternoon and had been struck, unwillingly and then willingly, by the way they moved through the world beside each other, two people who had found a genuine equilibrium and were quietly, unperformatively glad of it. The baby arrived in late May of 1880, a boy, loud and emphatic from his first moment, with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes. They named him Samuel, for no particular reason except that it sat right in both their mouths when they tried it. Abraham held his son with the same careful, deliberate attention he brought to all important things, and the expression on his face was one that Julia memorized and kept alongside all the other things she had been keeping since the first morning she had watched him scratch an old dog's ears without knowing anyone was watching. Biscuit, remarkable and determined, lived to see Samuel born. He passed on a warm evening in June with his head in Abraham's lap and the whole household nearby, which was exactly as it should have been, and they buried him under the cottonwood tree by the gate, in the shade his favorite kind of afternoon had been. Abraham sat by that tree for a long while afterward, and Julia brought him coffee and sat beside him with Samuel sleeping against her shoulder, and after a long quiet Abraham said, "He was a good dog." "He was the best," Julia said. "Catherine would have cried for a week," he said, and it came out the way it did when he spoke of her now with warmth rather than only pain, the sorrow still real but sitting alongside love and time in a way that did not close anything off. "I cried for at least 2 days," Julia said honestly, "and I only knew him for less than 2 years." He looked at her and something eased in him, the way things eased now in ways they had not before. "Thank you for that," he said. Years moved through Broken Spur Ranch with the rhythm of a working life. Samuel grew into a boy who had his father's dark stillness and his mother's relentless curiosity, a combination that produced someone who observed everything with great precision and then asked extremely specific questions about what he had observed. He followed Ernesto around the barn with a devotion that Ernesto received with the gravity the attention deserved, teaching him the horses' names and their individual personalities and the right way to approach each one. A daughter came 3 years after Samuel, in the spring of 1883. They named her Clara, and she arrived in the world with a look of absolute confidence that suggested she had already given the situation considerable thought and had decided she was satisfied with it. She had Julia's chestnut hair and Abraham's dark eyes and was, from the first day, entirely herself. Redemption Creek grew through those years, as frontier towns did, acquiring a proper steeple for the church, a second general store, a doctor who settled permanently, a telegraph office, and eventually a small newspaper whose editor was a woman from Ohio named Prudence, which delighted Julia, who subscribed immediately and visited the office to introduce herself within the first week of publication. The ranch expanded in the way that good ranches do when they are well managed, and the land is tended rather than exhausted, adding acreage to the east when the family that had worked it decided to go to California, bringing more cattle and eventually a small horse breeding operation that was Abraham's project, and that grew into something genuinely fine over the years, the horses from Broken Spur developing a reputation in the county for quality. Abraham was not, in those years, a man that Redemption Creek still described as cold. He was known as a man who was plain-spoken and did not waste words, but also as one who was reliable, fair with his employees, and who had the particular reputation for quiet generosity that attaches to people who do not perform their kindness but who exercise it consistently and without needing to be observed doing so. He sat on the county water board for 2 years. He helped the Red Hawk family when Marsh's lawyer tried a different angle of encroachment on their eastern acreage, connecting them with the surveyor and attending the county meeting, alongside them with the same contained, prepared competence he had brought to his own dispute. Julia taught the children to read, both the ones in her own household and eventually several from neighboring operations whose parents had limited schooling of their own. She corresponded with her former neighbor in Virginia and eventually, in 1884, with her brother, who had wound up in New Mexico and was working a silver claim, and who wrote a long, chaotic letter full of apologies and news that she read twice and answered with honesty and without bitterness, because she had more than enough life to be getting on with to spend it holding grudges. One evening in the autumn of 1885, when the children were in bed and the ranch was quiet in the way it was quiet in the deep of a clear October night, Julia and Abraham sat on the porch in the 2 chairs that had been replaced twice over the years but always sat in the same spot, and drank their coffee and watched the stars perform their slow westward drift above the limestone hills. She was thinking, with the contentment of someone whose life has arranged itself into something genuinely good, about nothing in particular, which was a kind of thinking she had come to appreciate. "Do you remember," she said, after a while, "what everyone in town told me before I ever met you?" He looked at her sidelong. "I have some idea," he said. "Cold," she said, "cruel, difficult. The stagecoach driver, Mrs. Drummond, the boy sweeping the store porch, all 3 of them before I even reached your gate. And," he said, and there was a dryness in it that meant he was already smiling slightly, the small private smile she had been collecting for years. "And I came out here prepared for something quite different from what I found," she said. "Which was?" he said. She looked at him. The man who scratched old dogs' ears in the early morning, who wrote letters in secret to widows who needed help with doctor bills, who laughed in the rain when he had not expected to find anything funny, who had ridden to a neighbor's defense as readily as his own, who held his children with the same careful, deliberate attention he brought to all things he loved, who had said her name for the first time on a cold wagon bench under a Texas sky full of stars, as if the sound of it was something he had been saving up. A man who was exactly as good as he thought no one was noticing, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over in the old, habitual way, the way that had become as natural as breathing, and took her hand. "I noticed you noticing," he said. She laughed. "I know, that was rather the beginning of everything." The stars moved overhead in their slow, ancient progression. Down in the barn, one of the horses shifted, and the sound of it came across the quiet yard, familiar and good. Somewhere in the house, Samuel made the small sound he made sometimes in his sleep, a brief murmur of whatever it was that 8-year-olds dreamed about, and Clara, who slept like a stone through anything, did not make a sound at all. The ranch was dark and warm and full, and the night was clear and cold and endless, and Julia Blackwell Collier sat beside her husband on the porch of the life they had built together from a single advertisement in a Richmond paper, and one woman's decision to come west and see what she would find when she looked for herself. She had been told the cowboy was cold and cruel. Every single thing she had seen had proved otherwise. And in the proof of it, in the slow and careful accumulation of mornings and evenings and rainstorms and fence lines and lamplit tables and two children sleeping in the house behind them, she had found everything she had not known she was looking for when she stepped off a stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the summer of 1878, with a trunk and a carpet bag and the intention to form her own conclusions. She had formed them. They were sitting beside her, holding her hand, watching the stars. In the years that came after, Broken Spur Ranch would continue to grow. Samuel would eventually prove himself a horseman of real talent, inheriting his father's patience and his mother's eye for the particular quality of a thing, and the horse breeding operation would become his in time, taken over with the careful pride of someone who understands what it costs to build and what it means to carry forward. Clara would go east to study, shocking exactly nobody who knew her well, returning with a medical degree that made her the first woman physician in 3 counties, and the specific, organized brilliance she brought to it would serve the people of that region for decades. Ernesto stayed at Broken Spur until he was very old and could not work, and Abraham built him a small house on the property where he spent his final years with his sister's family nearby, visiting the horses on the days he felt able, drinking coffee on the porch in the mornings, and receiving Samuel's devoted attention with the grace of someone who has earned what they are given. The land held. The fence line stood. The creek ran clear through the cypress in the seasons that it ran, and went quiet in the driest years, but always came back. The cottonwood trees by the gate, the ones that had been planted by some previous hand, and had been young when Abraham first drove his wagon up this road, grew wider and taller, and their shade in the summer became something the whole household depended on. And on the porch, in 2 chairs that were replaced as needed but always in the same spot, Julia and Abraham Collier continued to drink their morning coffee and watch the sun come up over the limestone hills and say whatever needed saying and leave silent whatever was better left so, because they had learned between them that some of the most important things live in the quiet, if you know how to look for them, which she had always known how to do, and which he, it turned out, had been doing all along.